When I was a kid, my grandpa was a huge coin collector. In fact, he still is. He's almost 90 years old. He loves coins just as much as he loves probably anything in this world. He's been collecting them my whole life. And I remember when I was a kid, he would often have coins around. He would teach me about different coins. He'd have coin collections that he loved to share with me. My grandpa for decades was a banker in Lidgerwood, and so he would see coins come by all day long, and so he seemingly knew everything there was to know about coins, and he also knew, and this was the best part about collecting coins, is he knew which ones were valuable. I have distinct memories of sitting in their house, and at their kitchen table or dining room table, there would be coins all spread out that he had collected from pocket change in different places, and he'd have jars that would be sorted into different coins, and he would pick up a coin, and he'd always do the same thing. He'd take off his glasses, and he would look at it. He'd squint to see what was on that coin, and me being younger and having better eyesight, he would hold it in front of my face, and I would tell him, what exactly I saw. And one of the things that I learned was value sometimes could fluctuate greatly based on little things. Maybe there was a little S on that penny instead of a D or a P, which meant that it was possibly worth more money or more valuable. Certain years, coins were more scarce. There were war years when pennies were made out of different materials, and there were all these facts, and my grandpa seemed to know them all. And always the amazing thing to me was that there could be value sometimes right under your nose, and most people wouldn't even know it. In fact, today, if you went and you still use change, and you have a piggy bank, or I don't know what you have, a jar, and you went through that, there is a small possibility, but a possibility that there is value right underneath your nose. In fact, I just looked up some of the most valuable coins, and some of the most valuable coins today aren't even old ones. They're they're newer, but they're rare for different reasons. For example, a 1972 Lincoln cent. 1972 penny. There were certain ones printed with an error. If you found that specific penny, you could sell that on eBay for as much as $325 a penny. A Wisconsin quarter from 2005. Some of those, you probably remember the state quarters. Some of them were printed with a little extra line. If you found one of those quarters in your piggy bank, $152 roughly that quarter is worth. Or in certainly my lifetime, many of your lifetimes, 2000 Sacagawea golden dollar. I actually remember this promotion. Cheerios had a promotion where they would include coins in the boxes of cereal. Some of those Sacagawea dollars had a particular eagle feature on it that was rare. If you had one of those, it is worth $5,000 to $25,000. Which is amazing that here is, and lots of things have value, but money is really interesting because money has a value on it. It says like 1 cent, 25 cents, $1, but it might actually be worth more than that. Some things are more valuable. Here's what I'm getting at this morning. Some things are more valuable than we realize. Sometimes there's value around us and we don't even know it. Things that we don't value might actually have a lot of value. And I've been thinking about this, particularly this week, as here it's Palm Sunday. We enter into Easter, Holy Week, Good Friday, Easter. We tell the stories of Jesus' death and resurrection. And one of the things that happens sometimes when we tell these stories is these stories stop losing their value for some of us because maybe we've heard them so much. In fact, if you ask any preacher, what are the hardest seasons to preach on, I have a pretty good guess that person will tell you, that preacher will tell you, Easter and Christmas are two of the toughest times because we talk about these stories that for many of us, we've heard that before. I know the Christmas story. I know about the shepherds and the wise men. I know about Jesus' death and resurrection, and it starts to possibly lose its value. It becomes routine. For some of you in this room, you have spent a lot of Palm Sundays in your lifetime. I was doing the math. It's not very hard this week. This is the 12th time here at Rose Hill I've gone through an Easter series or an Easter season. Sometimes we want novelty and new things we've never heard before. We want Bitcoin, not a wheat penny. And yet face value can be deceiving. And could it be that even though that story is routine and we've heard it before, it's much more valuable than we realize? And that's something Jesus taught and Jesus points out in a story that we're going to look at today. And so we're going to talk about that this morning, the value of Jesus' death and resurrection. Please open up a Bible or turn it on or whatever you do, however you access God's Word. And you can turn to Matthew chapter 26. As we'll be looking through a story this morning, we're continuing a series we've been going through called Jesus Asks a Question. Every week we've been looking at a question that Jesus asked. On face value, some of those questions are pretty mundane, pretty normal, don't have a lot behind them. But as we've been seeing, some of his questions are questions that are important for us to wrestle with. And we'll look at another one this morning in the context of this story. And just to kind of set the stage, as we talked about last week, as the gospel writers are telling the story of Jesus, one of the things that we see is Jesus, throughout the story, gets closer and closer to Jerusalem. We find out pretty early on in the narrative that something big is going to happen to Jesus. He's been predicting his death. We know something's happening in Jerusalem. This is the capital of the Jewish world, and so Jesus is heading closer and closer. And he's getting closer, and he ends up in this story in a town called Bethany. Bethany was within walking distance to Jerusalem. It was sort of a bedroom community. And so at this point, Jesus is getting close to Jerusalem. He's staying in Bethany, probably with some friends. One of the things we know about Jesus is he was very close to a family, Mary and Martha, two sisters, their brother Lazarus. They weren't just people who were around Jesus, they were good friends of his. And so Jesus is probably staying near them on purpose. I love this picture. It's a great picture of friendship. Here's Jesus. He knows he's going to die soon. If you were going to die soon, who would you want to be in the presence of? Probably friends and family. And so here are friends that are like family to Jesus, and he's with them in Bethany. This is probably happening. This story is probably happening, though Matthew puts it after the triumphal entry. John puts it differently, and most scholars think this scene probably happened the night before the triumphal entry, which would have been, if we're like tracking Easter week, it would have been last night. And that's how close it was to Easter, that Jesus is in Bethany, and he's sitting in this house and he's having a meal. We're told that he's, in that first verse, you see in verse 6, that he's in the home of a man called Simon the leper. That's what Matthew calls him. Not a great name if you're picking one out, but this was what they called this guy. He was probably at one time in his life a leper. He wouldn't have been a leper still at this time, otherwise they wouldn't be eating dinner with him. That was not kosher, that was not considered okay. And so here's a man that Jesus had probably healed. And they're sitting having a meal together. Jesus is the distinguished guest, a rabbi. They're maybe celebrating him, possibly celebrating some of the work that he's done, possibly celebrating that he's there in town visiting. And as they're sitting there, we're told that a woman walks in. Matthew doesn't tell us anything else about this woman, but she walks in and he tells us what she's carrying. She's carrying an alabaster jar, and it's filled with perfume. The fact that it's alabaster means it was very, very valuable. It would be like one of the most valuable things someone probably owned in those days. The way that you would get the perfume out of an alabaster jar is you would break the neck off, and then you could pour the perfume out of it. So it's sort of a one-time use thing. And here this woman comes and she takes this jar that's filled with perfume. Some of the other gospel writers tell us that it's very valuable. It's probably perfume that comes from India, which would have been very expensive a long ways away. John tells us that this valuable is worth 300 denarii, which would have been the equivalent of an entire working man's yearly salary. I want you to think of that. A year's salary that's common today on simply a jar of perfume. That's this item that's very valuable, this item that this woman is bringing in. Matthew uses the word to describe it. He calls it the perfume literally myrrh. He's probably jogging in our memories back to a story that only he tells in the beginning of Jesus' life as the wise men come. One of them have myrrh, and so he's kind of jogging our memories as we're getting this picture of this king. The gospel includes a lot of miracles, but it includes a couple miracles. Get it? Never mind. So here's this myrrh, this woman with this perfume, and she takes it and she breaks it and she pours it on Jesus' head. This is the scene that's set for us as this perfume is poured on his head. Now, this is pretty weird to us. It would have been a little outlandish, but probably not as weird in those days. It was something, a sign of reverence and respect. I don't know, maybe you can picture like pouring Gatorade on a coach's head after a big game or something like that, but they're doing this to Jesus because it's a sign of honor. But what people notice around them is not the fact that she's doing this, it's not the fact that it's weird, but what bothers the people who are watching is the fact that she took something so valuable and she, in their eyes, wasted it on Jesus. The issue becomes the sheer value. So we'll jump into this passage, verse 8. The disciples saw this, they were indignant. Why this waste? They asked. Notice the word waste. This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor. So here's the disciples watching this, and they're indignant is the word there. There's this righteous sort of indignation, this outrage. How dare she? As they're watching something which this woman thought was beautiful, she thought it was a sign of reverence. But what do they have for her? Nothing but judgment. Unfortunately, this kind of righteous indignation can be very common in Christianity, especially if we're not careful. Sometimes somebody does something that they think is worship, but we tend to, if we're not careful, pick on people for the way that they're worshiping and they're not worshiping the right way. There's been two high-profile cases in the last few months. One of them was at Asbury Seminary. There was a revival, and even as soon as it happened, there was all sorts of commentary from the Christian world about if it was really a revival and what was really going on there. Very similar. I think a few weeks, not even a week, but before that, there was a big campaign during the Super Bowl, evangelistic campaign, and there were people during that who were criticizing what was going on. People spending money, and one of the things Christians were saying, it was very common, was, man, imagine what else they could have done with that money. Instead, they just told people to go to a website to read about Jesus. There's a sort of righteous indignation. I'm not defending necessarily either one of those events, but the thing that I think is that sometimes we need to pause and not be so quick to judge motives. Because Jesus is seeing what's going on. He sees this judgment. He hears this judgment, and notice how he responds. Next verse, aware of this. Jesus said to them, why are you bothering this woman? Here's our question this morning. Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. Jesus asks a piercing question. Why are you bothering her? Why are you judging her? Notice here just the contrast. The disciples see this. They label what's going on. Waste. That's the word Matthew uses. What a waste. But Jesus labels it differently. What a beautiful thing. He looks at what everyone else is calling a waste, and he says, no. This is beautiful. The value she's placing on me in this moment. You will always have the poor, he says, but you won't always have me. He begins to define it in terms of their time and relationship and proximity to Jesus. Then he continues. Remember the context. He knows the next morning, probably, he's going to go into Jerusalem. And so he says, verse 12, when she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. So Jesus here seeing everything that's going on in light of his death. And the disciples don't see it yet. They don't understand. They've heard Jesus talk about his death, but they're not really absorbing it. They're not really can't really grasp what's really going to happen. Only Jesus really knows that. And a much bigger event is going to happen than even they realize. Now, we'll come back to some of this and what Jesus is saying here. But I want to point out that Matthew's focus in this story is value. In other words, what Matthew is pointing out to us in this story, and every one of the gospel writers tell us a story similar to this. It's probably not the only time something like this happened in Jesus' ministry. But what Matthew wants us to see from this story is value. Right? Here's this woman. She has this alabaster jar. It is valuable. So what is the value? What is the value of a jar of perfume? What is the value of a woman with faith? What is the value of a disciple? What is the value of rising from the dead? Jesus is emphatically telling us that nothing is more valuable than Jesus' death and resurrection. Nothing on this earth, nothing on this planet, nothing that we can own, nothing that we can have or have proximity to is as valuable as Jesus' death and resurrection. That's why what the disciples say, this is a waste. That's a waste of value. That's expensive. That's fancy. Jesus says, no, there's something way more valuable. That's just a worldly thing. Let me tell you about something that's eternal. The disciples were outraged. But Jesus said, no, it's a beautiful thing. Jesus wants his disciples to understand that they are misvaluing the cost of Jesus and what he's about to do. I think there's an importance for us as Christians in sort of a value-obsessed world for us to understand no matter what we're surrounded by, no matter what we have, whatever we want, that we have something in Jesus' death and resurrection that is for real more valuable than anything else. See, we all set value differently. Every one of us, and we could probably, if we shared what we like to spend money on, we could have righteous indignation and probably judge how other people spend their money, but we all value things differently. You might value something in your life I don't value very much, and I might value something you don't value. We all value different things. As I've gotten older, one of the things that I've personally thought differently about is flying. I used to think that the best value, if you were going somewhere, I would always look for what's the best deal as far as money. What's the best? What's the cheapest ticket I can find? Doesn't matter the airport. Doesn't matter how long the layover. I was just looking, for that price. And I have slept in enough airports using my duffel bag as a pillow. You ever done that? Not cool. I have had huge layovers. I have pulled into cities at 2 a.m. when nothing is open and there's no services whatsoever to realize, okay, the way that I need to value that is probably a little different. We all value different things, so now I place value there a little differently. I process through it differently. There's not a single one of us that doesn't care about value, but what we value is different. So here's my question for you this morning. And for everyone else, our values are different, but this one shouldn't be. What is the value to you of Jesus' resurrection? What does Jesus' death and resurrection mean for you? Because there's not a material possession, not a car, not a house, not a tract of land, piece of property, not a hedge fund that's as valuable in the end as Jesus. So we're going to continue to explore Jesus' death and resurrection. But the way I want to do it is by looking at a few assumptions that Jesus makes here. Because what I find interesting about this story is it's not just about the face value of this story, but there's some assumptions that Jesus makes that I think are crucial. And in assuming them, Jesus is giving value to these things. So there's 3 of them this morning that help set our priorities straight. The first one is Jesus' assumption that Jesus' death isn't the end of the story. Excuse me. Jesus' death isn't the end of the story. Jesus knows something nobody else does, that he's going to die. Jesus knows at this point he is within his last week of life here on earth. But he also knows, and when we read between the lines in this story, it stands out to us as Jesus also knows that that's not the end of the story. He's thinking about this woman's story, what's going to happen afterwards. He knows that his mission is going to continue in the world. Notice he mentions here specifically the phrase, the gospel, or the good news. which is a weird thing to describe the story of somebody dying, right? You don't think of your death as like good news, but he said this is going to go out as good news. There's an assumption here. Something good is going to happen through his death. Most movements in history die when their leaders die. That's true of most things. In fact, we know this is actually mentioned a little bit in the gospel accounts and in Acts. But we know from history, Jewish history, that Jesus wasn't the first person to come and claim to be the Messiah or for people to think he was the Messiah. In fact, there were several before Jesus, but you know what happened? They died. And their followers dissipated, and that was the end of it. But Jesus was different because his death wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was just the beginning. Because we know what he knew, which is he was going to rise again out of the grave. It's important for us as Christians, if we're going to accept that message, to understand that Jesus' death is not the end of the story. It can't be the end of the story if he's worth trusting and believing in and celebrating. There are plenty of people in this world who think that Jesus was a real person, lived a great life, but don't believe that he rose again from the grave. In fact, most people, if you ask historians and people who are atheists, most would say, yeah, we know enough about Jesus to know that he was a real person. He's written about in history. They believe that. What differentiates them from true believers is they don't believe Jesus rose from the grave. How could you believe something so miraculous as that? But the truth is that as Christians, we believe that Jesus rose from the grave. Do you believe that Jesus rose from the grave? And Jesus is infinitely more valuable to us if he's risen from the grave than if he was just a great man who taught nice things and he died. Jesus is not like the bank robber in a Western movie, wanted, dead or alive. If he's dead, we wouldn't want him as our Savior. In fact, Paul makes this point in a letter to the Corinthians where he argues that if Christians, if we don't have the resurrection, we don't have anything. He says if Christ wasn't crucified and resurrected from the grave, why are we doing any of this? But we follow him because he died and rose again. His death and resurrection are valuable to us as Christians. Second assumption Jesus makes is that the gospel message is to be broadcast around the world. Truly I tell you, verse 13, wherever this gospel is preached around the world, what she has done will be told. Jesus knew that the good news was going to go out around the world. He assumed it. He assumed that his followers were going to take this message out into the world. Early church historians believe that one of the reasons Matthew wrote it, included it kind of like this, is that probably by the time Matthew's gospel got to the early church, and it was sent to churches all around the ancient Near East, that they had already known about Jesus' death and resurrection. They were believers, and they had probably heard this story. So it is likely that the story of this woman pouring perfume on Jesus' head had become one of those things that was just a common part of the story of Jesus. It was a common part of the gospel, that he was anointed, which you would do to a body in burial before he died. Jesus told us this. It's a beautiful thing. It's not a waste. It's a beautiful thing. The gospel is made to be shared. Notice it's called good news. It's something to be shared. If you're looking for an activity in your quiet time this week as you prepare for Easter, I'd encourage you to go through one of the gospel accounts of Jesus' last few days, or go through Matthew. Great place to start. And look at all the times Jesus told his followers to go. Or use that word, go. We have this, right? The gospel is going to go out. We have Jesus coming up out of the grave. What's the first thing that he says when he sees the women at the tomb? Is he tells them, go, tell. There's that word, go. Then he gives the Great Commission. Very last thing at the end of Matthew, and he tells his disciples, and thereby all of us, all Christians, to go and make disciples. The gospel message is made to be broadcast around the world. And here's the truth, and this might be a hard thing for you to grasp. It's been a hard thing for me to grasp at times in my life. The truth is that if we valued the gospel, we would share it. If we really valued the gospel, we'd share it. If you find yourself at times embarrassed to share the good news of Jesus, I think it's worth asking why that is. And there's times of my life where I've had to ask myself, why is it so hard sometimes to share the gospel? What does that say about the value that I apply to it? People who are close to you know the things that you value. Your friends probably know your favorite TV shows and movies because maybe you quote them all the time. They know your activities and your hobbies because you talk about them. Do they know the message of Jesus? Do they know the value of Jesus and his death and resurrection for your life? The value of your testimony. And then last assumption that Jesus makes is taking care of the poor is essential to being a follower of Jesus. Taking care of the poor is essential to being a follower of Jesus. Notice when the disciples say, well, that money could be sold and given to the poor. Jesus doesn't respond by saying, giving to the poor is stupid. No, he says, wait, you'll have a whole lot of time to give to the poor and help people in need. It's just not the time because right now I'm going to the grave and to the cross and the grave. So what we see here is the assumption Jesus is making is not that meeting needs is not important. It's very important. But it's not the most important thing, and certainly at that moment. But we see Jesus' life. Jesus hung out with people who had needs. He helped people who had needs. He lived this out. As we go through the book of Acts, we read about the early apostles and their mission to the world. We see that they often helped people who were poor, widows, orphans, people who had needs. This was an important part of the church and what they did on a regular basis. It doesn't seem like this should have to be said, but I think more and more in, at least in our country and some of the Christian culture, we view helping people more and more negative. In the last few years, I've watched as this phrase social justice has kind of become a swear word in Christian circles, and some of that is a reaction against people who have kind of thrown out the gospel and just become so concentrated on social justice that it kind of drowns out the message. And yet the fact is we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We have to understand that part of what Jesus did was social justice and the fact that he had a huge emphasis on helping people who had needs and people who were the poor of society. He told the Beatitudes that were centered on people like that. But we also have to understand that the most important thing that we need is the gospel. Sometimes I hear people say things like, well, people don't need our money. What they really need is the gospel. But for Jesus, those two things weren't so easily separated. They very much went together. And if we accept the gospel, and if Jesus becomes the most valuable thing, it changes everything in our priorities. And we begin to demonstrate the love of Jesus through acts of love and acts of compassion. When we make Jesus the most important, valuable thing in our life, it has a trickle-down effect on all of our other values. So some of the things that we do here at Rose Hill, and you don't always see some of the ministries we do kind of on the outside, but we have, among other things that we do, one of the things that we organizations we work really closely with is the Marshall County Food Pantry. In fact, for years, I think for almost a decade, we packed boxes right before Easter for their Easter giveaway. This year, there will be some from our church, and I think there's probably still room to help if you want to talk to Lacey Holland after the service about that. We'll have people on Friday and Saturday helping give away boxes at the Marshall County Food Pantry because there's so many needs in our community that need to be met. And I think it's really easy sometimes to not assign a lot of value to ministries like that. And the truth is, I think ministries like that are very, very important. And they sure were to the early church because the early church saw an importance to showing compassion. Taking care of people who have needs is essential to being a follower of Jesus because it's a demonstration of God's love and his mercy and his grace. So we're going to close here in a few minutes, but I want you to wrestle with this question. Since we're in a series about questions, here's the question I want you to wrestle with this morning and this afternoon and this week. What does Easter mean to you? What value does Jesus' death and resurrection hold for you? Is it true that nothing is more valuable in your life than Jesus' death and resurrection? Here's what the Apostle Paul said about this, and you might be familiar with this passage. I love this passage, but Paul was talking about what's most important to him. Here's Philippians 3, and Paul writes this: "What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth," notice that phrase, surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, that I may gain Christ and be found in him. So I consider everything else in my life a loss because of the surpassing value. That word surpassing value, or that phrase, it literally means to be better than. He's saying the worth of knowing Jesus is better than anything. And what a phrase for Jesus, or for Paul to say, I consider everything else garbage. Imagine walking into your house and looking at all the things that you've collected, all the things you love, all your tokens of memories in your life, and going, garbage, 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 garbage. And Paul said, everything else in my life compared to Jesus is garbage because he's the most valuable. And then he continues, verse 10, he says, I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. What did it come down to for Paul? Again, the resurrection. Jesus died and rose again from the grave. And notice that it had a personal impact for Paul. It wasn't just a cool story you tell on Easter. It was something that affected his life, and he knew that what Jesus did when he died and rose again, he was demonstrating, here's the life I have for you. Here's the life I have for you. You will leave this earth one day, and you will die just like I died, and yet you will rise again and live again because of what Jesus has done, becoming like him in death, but becoming like him in resurrection. Jesus was paving the way for us. And that means that one day we will leave this earth behind, and we will leave everything else behind, everything that we value so much in life, everything that we love in this life. Everything's going to pass and fade away, but one thing will not pass if we put our faith in Jesus. That is, we will have life with him. That relationship with him will never die. It'll just grow deeper and deeper. We'll have an eternal dwelling, which is way more valuable than anything here on earth. So I want to challenge you this week to engage. Engage in the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. Spend some time focusing on what he's done for you, asking yourself the question, what does Easter mean for me? Don't make this just another week in the calendar. Do you really see, ask yourself this question, do you really see Jesus as the most valuable thing in your life? Does the way you live your life reflect that value? How might that change decisions you're in the process of making right now? How might that affect the way that you handle your finances, or the way you spend your free time, or your commitment level to certain causes? Just like Paul, we need to recognize that Jesus' death and resurrection have a real impact on our lives as believers. Value can be deceiving, and some of the things that we value most in this life are fleeting and will perish one day. But Jesus' death and resurrection is eternal, and there's nothing on earth that's more valuable than it. Will you pray with me?